So this is the New Life Virtual Mental Health Summit. I understand you guys are doing a whole mental health emphasis this weekend, and I'm so glad to be a part of it. You had wanted me to talk a little bit about anxiety tonight, but I want to just start out by sharing with you what I do and a little about the ministry that has led me to develop these workshops. The ministry is called Abide Network. It is a group of mental health providers and professional and paraprofessional that provide virtual mental health coaching. We also do workshops, and we do a free Bible study every Friday night, and we do free telephone support groups. And pretty much all of what we do is virtual. We want to have some kind of in-person conference once a year, but we've just gotten very used to doing things virtually. So we are providing these services virtually, and it's really worked out well because we can reach anyone in the world with these services. And we've got people all over the world, literally, that train as coaches, that come for our services. And it's really exploded, particularly during COVID, when a lot of businesses were folding, our business was taking off. So I want to explain just a little to you about how Abide works. I have this central thing here on this slide called the Abide community. It's kind of the group of people that are being impacted by Abide that also work with Abide. And as I mentioned, we have trainings, workshops, we have support groups and coaching, and all of those things kind of contribute to the Abide community. People that take the Abide helper training become providers and leaders within the Abide network. So the network has listed these different coaches on our website. We have almost 50. Now, I started out about 10, 12 years ago with just a couple of other counselors, and the network has really grown, and people keep taking the training and keep getting ready and providing mental health services to people. So we're really grateful for what God is doing. As I mentioned a minute ago, the larger workshop that I'm working from in these presentations that I'm making is called the Anxiety and Depression Relief Workshop. Anxiety and depression are the two most common mental health disorders. Pretty much just about everyone that comes to see me or another provider in the Abide network is going to have anxiety or depression or both. Not all, but almost all. And so we're going to start with anxiety. Little boy, his mother said, "Would you go get me a can of soup?" And little boy said he was afraid to go in the dark pantry. And she said, "Don't worry, God will be with you." So the little boy went to the door of the pantry and said, "God, if you're in there, will you hand me that can of soup?" One person said that we're 90% water. We're basically cucumbers with anxiety. So anxiety is a super common disorder. In fact, it's the most, if you can include all the different anxiety disorders as a cluster, anxiety is the most common mental health disorder. About 30% of people globally will have diagnosable anxiety sometime in their lifetime, about 30% of people. It's extremely common. So you're in good company with many other people, if you struggle with anxiety, with many other people who have also struggled. So let's look at some definitions here. A dictionary definition for anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. A clinical definition would be a mental health disorder characterized by feelings of worry or fear that are strong enough to interfere with one's daily activities. So that's what you're going to find with diagnosis. Like, all of us experience anxiety, all of us experience sadness. When it gets diagnosable is the point at which it affects your functionality, your ability to carry on relationships, to work, to survive, to function. Then it kind of crosses over that threshold into a diagnosable disorder. So anxiety becomes unmanageable when it heightens to the point where it's triggered by the possibility of danger rather than its probability. So that's a very key point. When we look at anxiety, we have to consider the fact that there are dangers in the world and there are things to be afraid of. but it becomes a disorder and unmanageable when it gets to the point where it's triggered by the possibility of danger. Because think about it, if we aren't anxious about anything, and like I burned my I had a burn pile in my yard today, and I was burning, leaves and branches and so forth. And I needed to have a certain amount of anxiety so that I was paying attention so that the burn didn't get out of control. There is a need for anxiety in this dangerous world in which we live. And if things could probably occur, we should probably be anxious about them. And that anxiety will serve us well when there's that probability. But what about if you open up your anxiety reaction to the possibility of danger? That means that an infinite number of things could happen. I mean, a 747 could come careening out of the sky and crash into my kitchen. Um, there could be a bomb in my backyard. A big alligator could come out and attack my husband. The million different things could happen. Very unlikely that those things would happen, but the possibility is there. And if I'm going to open my anxiety reaction to the possibilities, I'm never going to stop being anxious. So it's very important to confine our anxiety responses to what is probable. So let's talk about what happens in anxiety on a nervous system level. Let's look at some of the physiology of anxiety. You have two basic branches, if you can say it this way, of your nervous system, the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic nervous system is the part of your nervous system or the function of your nervous system that is controlled by conscious thought. So I'm moving my arm. I'm consciously choosing to move my arm. The autonomic function of your nervous system is the part of your nervous system that functions automatically. Hear that word, autonomic, automatic, same thing. Now, if I keep moving my arm consciously, eventually my heart rate will go up and my breathing will increase. So that's both the somatic and the autonomic working together. When you get to the autonomic nervous system, there's going to be two basic functions, the sympathetic response and the parasympathetic response. So think of the sympathetic response as sympathy or emotional arousal, and think of the parasympathetic as closing down that emotional arousal. Another way we define this is we say the sympathetic response is fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So the sympathetic response is the activation of the nervous system, and the parasympathetic is the shutting down of the nervous system. We want those to both be working. We want to be able to shut down when it's time to sleep, and we want to be able to experience activation when it's time to pay attention and to be awake. We like to talk about fight or flight, and for many years, that's the way we described the experience of nervous system arousal, but we've in the recent years added freeze, because sometimes people go into kind of deer in the headlights mode when they're anxious and they just kind of shut down and do nothing. So those are the three basic responses to nervous system arousal: fight, flight, and freeze. And each of them has their own set of kind of, physiologic correlates. So for instance, the fight response, you're going to have hyperventilation, you're going to have a defensive stance, blood is going to go to your muscles and away from your organs. The flight response, you're going to get lots of, you're going to have wide eyes and you're going to be tense. Then there is a whole different set of physiologic correlates for a freeze, pale skin, holding the breath, and this type of thing. And all of those are possible when we experience anxiety. Let's talk about some of the diagnoses that we might run across yourself or those you love. So here are some of the subtypes of anxiety: specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and agoraphobia. Now, what's going to happen is these are listed actually in the order of frequency. So let's take them one by one. Specific phobia is one of the most common diagnoses, anxiety diagnoses. And that's a phobia to something specific, just like it says. The most common are snakes and spiders, but people can have a specific phobia to just about anything. Things like fear of clowns, uh, emetophobia is fear of vomiting. There's a fear of the things on the right side of your body. There's a fear of things on the left side of your body. There's a fear of beautiful women, Venustrophobia. There's a fear of just about, a fear of beards, a fear of just about everything under the sun. So you can develop that specific phobia. Now, here's the thing, is that for many of these phobias, the thing that we're afraid of is actually something that's somewhat threatening. I mean, spiders and snakes can be dangerous. The problem with specific phobia is the proportionality is lost. The level of fear is way beyond the actual threat of danger. And so what we want to do is help bring about that proportionality where we have an appropriate response to threats. And then let's look at social anxiety disorder, which is kind of tied with with specific phobia for the most common type of anxiety. Social anxiety disorder is a disorder that comes about as the result of being in a social situation, typically an unscripted situation where we kind of have to decide what to do on the spot. That can be very threatening to some people, to not know what to do in a social situation. And that's, by the way, what makes social situations interesting, is that they're unscripted and kind of free for all. But also another aspect of social situations is the performative aspect. Typically, people with social anxiety are really triggered by anything that would require them to perform, such as public speaking. That's a very common fear, and it's sort of part of social anxiety. The fear of being evaluated negatively by others kind of lays at the foundation of that. Also very common. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which we're going to talk about more on Sunday, we call PTSD sometimes, and it isn't an anxiety disorder per se, but it is associated. What happens with PTSD is an individual gets exposed to a very traumatic event, and then as a result, they become very afraid, typically of the things that remind them of the event. So they develop patterns of avoidance of those reminders of the event, or what we call triggers. And then generalized anxiety disorder is when a person basically begins to worry about everything. And this is why it's so very important that when we work with anxiety disorders, we help people to overcome patterns of avoidance. Patterns of avoidance are pretty much standard practice in all, or standard features, I should say, of all the different anxiety disorders. We want to avoid things that make us feel afraid. The problem with that is the more we avoid, the more we heighten the fear, particularly when it's something that's not actually threatening. It's okay to avoid actual threats, but when you start avoiding things that are not actually threatening just because you're afraid of them, you're going to actually heighten and reinforce your fear. And then what happens is there's this contagious aspect where it tends to move from one fear to another, and the person becomes gradually afraid of more and more things, and they can end up in this generalized anxiety disorder condition. Panic disorder is a disorder that involves these very short duration, very intense experiences of anxiety. So those individuals are going to experience a spike in their anxiety that happens over a very short period of time, and they're going to feel like they're having a heart attack, or they're going to feel like they're dying. So there's a strong physiologic component to panic disorder. The individual will breathe heavy often. They'll feel like their heart's beating out of their chest. They'll break out into sweat. They'll have a number of different somatizations of that panic response. I've had really good success with panic disorder, teaching people how to do a deep breathing exercise, which I'll be showing you a little bit later. And then agoraphobia is kind of related to panic disorder in that if a person starts having panic attacks, say, for example, when they are in an elevator, and because they're afraid of getting trapped in the elevator, they start having panic in the elevator, they can then develop a fear of having a panic attack. And people can actually get to the place where they're so afraid of having a panic attack that they start watching for the signals of a panic attack coming on. And maybe something that closely mimics that panic disorder. For instance, low blood sugar, they start to shake a little bit. They can start to think that that's a panic attack, and they can have a panic attack about having a panic attack when they're not having a panic attack. So as you can see, anxiety can tend to morph from one thing to another. And what happens with agoraphobia is that individual becomes afraid of circumstances in which they might experience that panic attack. So typically, people are afraid of being trapped in a crowd, being in an elevator, being on a bridge, or this type of thing. And so that's typically agoraphobia, is fear of being trapped in a given situation. Then another anxiety related disorder, which isn't specifically an anxiety disorder, is an obsessive compulsive disorder. And this disorder involves feelings of worry associated with invasive thoughts, what we call obsessions. And the individual will have an invasive thought or an obsession. And then typically what they will do is experience a spike in anxiety because of that invasive thought. And so they will engage in some kind of compulsive behavior to try to lower that anxiety. So obsessive compulsive disorder's classic presentation is hand washing. The individual's afraid of germs. They will experience invasive thoughts about the dangers of germs, that there's germs everywhere, and they will wash their hands to try to lower that anxiety. And it will work for a moment, but then that anxiety comes back and the individual really struggles to control that, and it can become very, very, very powerfully cyclical. Obsessive compulsive disorder is very, very difficult to treat. There are other anxiety disorders as well. Separation anxiety, typically experienced in children. Same thing with selective mutism, where children won't talk in certain situations. Substance and medication-induced anxiety, and anxiety disorder due to another medical condition. Some of these substances that can cause anxiety include alcohol, street drugs, caffeine, and nicotine. All of these can affect your nervous system. Anything that disrupts the delicate balance of your nervous system can ultimately worsen the chances of you getting some kind of diagnosable disorder. Caffeine is a touchy one for some people. They don't want to give up their coffee. They like those brown drinks. And I understand that. I like warm drinks as well. But for people with anxiety, caffeine is really counterindicated, and caffeine is a narcotic. It is the most widely used mood-altering drug in the world. People often see coffee, tea, and soft drinks simply as beverages rather than vehicles for a psychoactive drug. But caffeine can exacerbate anxiety and panic disorders. That's Roland Griffiths, PhD. Let's talk, what I'm going to do is, by the way, I'm going to get into, after defining anxiety and then depression and then trauma, I'm going to get into some various interventions for those things. And I'm going to kind of sprinkle them throughout my presentations. So when I share these remedies and these interventions, these things that will help improve our brain health and our psychological health, often what works for one works for the other. So there's a lot of crossover between these remedies. So for instance, exercise is very powerful for anxiety disorders, but it's also very powerful for depression. So I want you to take these remedies that I share with you and these interventions and apply them to any of the disorders that I'm talking about this weekend. So exercise is a powerful remedy. A wonderful book by John Rady called Spark. And in the book, he brings out that exercise improves memory, focus, motivation, serotonin. It helps regulate the mood regulating substance in the brain, neurotransmitter in the brain called serotonin. It helps regulate dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter through which we experience pleasure, and norepinephrine, which is the neurotransmitter that helps us focus. And then exercise also improves BDNF factor, which is something that helps with brain growth. What is actually happening, with exercise is that we are helping our brain develop new neuron connections. And so that can actually happen with just exercise. You can actually grow your brain through exercise. One of the real benefits of exercise is metabolizing stress hormones. Stress hormones are really bad for the body. So what happens with animals is they may be, say, for instance, a wildebeest in Africa. The lion comes into the field, and the wildebeest does what wildebeests do when they see a lion, it runs. In the running from the lion, it metabolizes all the stress hormones that are part of that anxiety response. And so ultimately, if the wildebeest doesn't get eaten by the lion, the wildebeest survives that spike in anxiety. The problem is with human beings is maybe we have a boss that's like a lion, and he comes into the field and we don't get to start running around the office like a crazy animal. We have to sit in our cubicle and deal with that, so we don't metabolize those hormones as effectively. And that's why it's so important that at the end of the day, you go out for that walk or you take that ride on your bicycle or whatever. A really good way to get solid brain growing type exercise is called high intensity interval training, or HIIT. What you do with high intensity interval training is you use gradual or moderate exercise, and then you intersperse it with more intense exercise. So you might walk for 5 minutes, then run for 30 seconds. Or you might cruise for 5 minutes on a bicycle and then pump hard for 30 seconds. And during those 100% periods, when you're really pushing as hard as you can, you're actually going to grow new brain neurons. It's really exciting. So let's also talk about hydration and water. That's a really important remedy for anxiety. And you wouldn't think so, but the amount of water you're drinking really is going to affect how you feel emotionally. It's amazing. A little while ago, I was really having trouble with restless leg syndrome. Restless leg syndrome is a syndrome, a tendency some people have where they lay down to sleep at night and their whole body is exhausted and wants to go to sleep, but their leg wants to stay up and have a party. That's how it feels. It feels like your leg has a mind of its own. And so the person with restless leg syndrome will be so frustrated because their leg won't calm down. It can be maddening. I was trying all kinds of different remedies. You can use quinine water because quinine is a nerve relaxer. I did try that. I tried getting out of bed and doing deep knee bends. That seemed to help a little bit. But what I finally realized was that I wasn't drinking enough water in the evening because I didn't want to get up at night and use the bathroom all night long. So I would stop drinking water at about 6 o'clock in the evening. And I was dehydrated by the time I went to bed. So I started to increase the amount of water, not a lot, but I did increase it enough to keep my blood volume up toward the end of the day. And I stopped getting restless leg syndrome. And I didn't get up any more often. So happy ending to that story. Water softens your food, it increases your blood volume, it transports nutrients to cells, it cools the body, and lubricates joints and muscles. Dehydration can affect cognitive function. A really good way to know if you're drinking enough water, and you should drink between 2 and 3 quarts of water per day. So a good way to know if you're hydrated enough is the toilet test. You want to make sure that your urine is pale. It shouldn't be colorless, but it needs to be pale. And if you take certain supplements, by the way, it's going to color your urine quite brightly. And so factor that in. I think it's certain vitamins that are going to color your urine. But if you're not taking those supplements, your urine should be pale. If it's dark yellow, that means you're not hydrated enough. Get that water in your system upon arising. It's very cleansing. It'll help activate your digestive system, help clean you out early in the morning, and get your blood pumping and get your energy flowing very early in the morning. Another use for water, and this is kind of surprising for some people, is hydrotherapy. And typically we use hydrotherapy for building the immune system and helping treat various physical ailments. But here's the fact, and that is that hydrotherapy really helps with mental health. I've experienced this firsthand. Hippocrates, by the way, said water therapy assays lassitude, which means it takes care of and makes go away depression. So let me tell you what I do. I'll tell you my experience. A couple of years ago, had a family vacation and had a negative encounter with a family member, and it was very upsetting. And I knew that I would be stressed out for that period and for the next few days. And I knew that I would probably become anxious and depressed because that's kind of where I go when I get upset. Well, the place where we were staying had a pool. It was in Florida, but it was pretty cold out and the pool wasn't heated. So the water was very cold in the pool, and they also had a jacuzzi. So every night I would fire up the jacuzzi and sit in that hot water for 3 minutes. And then I would jump in the cold pool for 30 seconds and I would go back to the hot water and then back to the pool 3 times. And I amazingly got through that experience with a lot less effect on my mood. It was very powerful. So this is from some scientific research. Hydrotherapy was compared in a French study to the benefits of the SSRI drug Paxil on 357 patients with generalized anxiety disorder. Some were given the drug, and Paxil does help anxiety disorder. So some were given the drug, others daily baths using natural mineral waters and massage. Both groups benefited, but the hydrotherapy group benefited more and stayed better longer. And the hydrotherapy had no side effects. The only side effects you're going to have with hydrotherapy are good side effects. It's going to build your immune system. It's going to help clear out your respiratory tract. It's going to get your blood circulating. Just good stuff is going to happen because of in fact, it'll help your skin look better. Good things happen with hydrotherapy, including mental health benefits. So what you can do to bring it home and make it simple is a hot and cold shower. This is what I recommend. Take a plastic chair, put it in your shower stall, and go under the hot water, not hot enough to burn your skin, obviously, but hot enough to heat up your body, and do that for 3 minutes, then turn it to full cold for 30 seconds and do that 3 times once a day and see if it doesn't improve your mood. I want to talk to you also about mindfulness. Mindfulness gets a lot of buzz in the scientific data on what helps anxiety. And many people who love Jesus and the scriptures are afraid of mindfulness because mindfulness came from Buddhism, and that's true. It did, the practice of mindfulness meditation does draw from Buddhist tradition. But here's the thing, is that there's no new thing under the sun. And mindfulness is biblical. And just because Buddha believed it doesn't mean that it isn't true. So let's look to scripture to see if something is real in scripture. And if it's there, let's use it. Even if other people who don't believe in Jesus use it, doesn't mean it's not going to work. And I'm glad it's working for them. So this is what mindfulness is. It's being fully engaged in your present experience, self-observing in a non-judgmental manner. In other words, you're acknowledging your emotions. Oh, I'm feeling anxious right now. But you don't judge those emotions. And you also don't let them tell you what's going to happen. So if you're feeling a sense of dread, like the future is dark, don't necessarily believe those emotions, but acknowledge the fact that you are experiencing them. That's mindfulness. Mindfulness is basically self-awareness with the goal of self-regulation. And we have to hold a very important tension, and that is acknowledging our negative emotions and accepting them without judging or pushing back, but at the same time doing what we can to improve those negative emotions and help ourselves feel better. And there's a tension between those two things because we kind of either want to say, okay, I'm going to feel terrible and that's just the way it is, or we're going to want to try to fix it. We have to strike that balance. This is what I'm experiencing right now. I'm acknowledging it. It's true. But then we have to go and try to make it better. Some of the effective aspects, as I've looked at the kind of meditation that is typically prescribed along the lines of Eastern meditation, there are some aspects of it that are completely okay and completely biblical, and I want to share those with you. One is breathing. Breathing deeply and slowly down regulates the nervous system, and we're going to be actually experiencing this in a moment here. And then in addition, focusing on one thing instead of being distracted constantly to everything that's around us is a really calming thing in and of itself. Recapturing the imagination is part of what I would call biblical meditation, where we direct our thoughts toward the things of God and we focus on those things, either imagining how beautiful heaven will be or maybe envisioning the closing scenes of Jesus' life. And then finally, this mindfulness thing where we acknowledge our feelings without judging them. Those are the effective aspects of mindfulness meditation. Now, there's something that we do called secondary disturbance, which mindfulness really helps with. Secondary disturbance is when we're disturbed and then disturbed about being disturbed. So we're anxious, and then we say, oh, this anxiety is going to kill me. And you're even more anxious. Or you're anxious, and then you say, I'm failing as a Christian because the Bible says not to fear. By the way, the Bible does say, do not fear over 300 times. But it doesn't say don't feel fear. I think what God is saying there is don't let your fears control you. Live a lifestyle of courage. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee. That's what God is saying is be of good courage and move forward and do the right thing, even if you have some feelings of anxiety. But the Bible never says don't feel fear. In fact, it fully acknowledges that the autonomic response is a real thing. People experience anxiety. That's part of being in this fallen world. So secondary disturbance, again, is being afraid and then being afraid about being afraid. It's okay to have these negative emotions. That's the thing we need to understand. And that will help us deal with that secondary disturbance, because acknowledging that we're having them is the beginning of actually doing something to improve them. So a very important skill to learn is called affect labeling. This is a big part of mindfulness, actually, is the ability to admit that you're experiencing emotion and talk about what it is. So what I have here is called the feelings wheel. You can download these from the internet. I recommend that you find this online, print it out, take it with you. And as you go from place to place and throughout your day, just once in a while, take a moment and acknowledge what your feelings are. So the way this works is it has 6 emotions and then it fans out into different aspects of those emotions. So joyful, excited, sensuous, energetic, cheerful, creative, hopeful, daring, fascinating, stimulating, amused, playful, optimistic. Maybe sad can be guilty, ashamed, depressed, lonely, bored, tired, or remorseful, stupid, inferior, isolated, apathetic, and sleepy. So learn how to name your emotions, expand your emotional vocabulary. My husband and I have this conversation often where he'll say, I don't want feelings. I just want facts when we're having a conversation about something. And I'll say, the fact is, I feel this way. There's nothing unfactual about admitting that you feel a certain way. And in fact, again, it's the beginning of doing something to be able to improve those emotions. So what we're going to do is a little breathing exercise here. I'm going to have you make a very small hole with your lips. You're going to breathe all the way out. And then you're going to breathe in on the word one. You're going to hold on hold. And you're going to breathe out on the word release. What I have done is I have written a song. I call it the breathing song. And it helps pace people's breathing. And I have put these songs in the beginning of some audio recordings that I've made called Jesus Meditations. And I'm going to be telling you a little more about those later, but let me do this song first, and we'll do this breathing exercise together. So make that little hole with your lips, if you would, please. And breathe all the way out. Now breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. Now hold. Now breathe out. Really slow. You're going to breathe in again. 1, 2. Really slow. Inhale. Hold. Breathe out. Stress, fear, let go. Now breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. Hold. Now breathe out. Stress, fear, go. You're going to breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. You're going to hold. You're going to breathe out. Stress, fear. Breathe in again. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. Now breathe out. Stress, fear. Breathe in. 1, 2, 3. Hold. Now breathe out. Okay. I want you to put in the chat how you feel now that you've done that deep breathing exercise. Now, I said that I would talk a little about Jesus meditations. What I did was I created a total of 120, not quite finished with some of them, but in the end, we're going to have 120 sound files that are about 10 minutes long. They begin with this breathing song. And the idea is that the person breathes while they listen to the rest of the audio recording. I go into a devotional that has something to do with mental health and spirituality. And then finally, we pray. And then there's finally a scripture song by Neville Peter, my dear friend, who is a wonderful artist. And he's a machine. The guy is so productive, and he writes these beautiful scripture songs. And we have produced, we're close to getting done with 120 of them. And they are free online. What you can do is go to Spotify, just put in Jesus Meditations, and you should be able to access them free. You can also go to my YouTube page, and they're on there as well. So a wonderful resource for you, and they are, again, free. That's what I have for you so far tonight. And I guess we're going to do a little Q&A. So do you guys have any questions or comments?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. This is the time for you guys. If you have any questions, you feel free to ask Dr. Jennifer. She will facilitate just about 10 minutes, no more than that, because it's late for some people who are joining from different parts of the world and different time zones. So just about 10 minutes of Q&A before we close.
Okay, Sister Anne-Marie.
Yes, good night. I'm all the way in Jamaica.
Okay.
And I found your presentation quite useful.
Okay, good.
What I want to find out for a person who suffers from claustrophobia, like the fear of being closed up in a small area, as you mentioned about the what process or what would you use? What would you recommend? How for that person to get over that type of phobia?
Yeah, usually the way that phobias are treated is through gradual exposure. So with claustrophobia, it might be something like um, the person will either do deep breathing or something to calm themselves down, prayer, this type of thing to sort of down regulate the nervous system. And then they'll do something that's a little bit anxiety provoking. You don't want to take the most anxiety provoking trigger right off the bat, but something like maybe they go in a closet or they go in a big closet or they go in a room and shut the door. I don't know how claustrophobic they are, but they would take a sort of a mild exposure on the first one and they stay in the situation, because every time that person leaves from something they feel closed in by, they're reinforcing that anxiety and they're building that association between the situation and the anxiety. So you want to build a new association in the brain. So you go ahead and you put them in a mildly anxiety provoking situation and they will eventually calm down. That's called rehabituating. Their nervous system will rehabituate and will start to feel calm. And then they, the next week they come in and they do the calming exercises, the grounding exercises again. And then they do that exposure, but they increase the intensity of the exposure each time. And you can really kind of reroute your nervous system if you do it that way. That could be helpful. Also, affect labeling. There was a study done on specific phobia of spiders, and the individuals labeled their feelings, and it helped as much as cognitive behavioral therapy. It helped as much as desensitization, which is what I just described, for them to just simply label the emotion. What happens when we label emotions? It tends to reduce the intensity of the emotion. So there's something about being able to verbalize a feeling that really helps people regulate it. So that's what a clinician would use. I don't know how severe the problem is. If it's really severe, they should probably work with a trained therapist to get through that process.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
I had a question. Hi,
Uh-huh.
my name is
Hi.
Charlotte.
Hi.
I just stepped up for a second, so hopefully I didn't miss this already. So you talked about PTSD and you also talked about a social anxiety disorder. Can the two be linked, like where you have a traumatic experience and like before you're really social
Yeah.
and then you become less social, or is it still PTSD?
No, it's absolute. They can be linked. The way I see it is that trauma is kind of like the mother of a lot of mental health issues. So a lot of times there are various problems that we're having can be traced back to a traumatic event. And so, yeah, absolutely. Like someone could have a traumatic event and then develop social anxiety disorder as a result of the traumatic event. And so like sometimes you have to process that trauma to be able to get through, get across to the other side, so to speak. So
Okay.
absolutely, yeah. The way I see it is like trauma, and I'll be talking more about this. I think it's Sunday night. Trauma kind of softens the brain. It makes the brain more susceptible to irrational thinking.
Mhm.
You have a really upsetting experience where one of the characteristics of an upsetting experience is it overwhelms your nervous system. You don't have any coping resources for what happens. So, when we're driving down the road and we slip a little because it's raining, that's going to cause some anxiety, but we can recover from that because, we have enough coping resources. But if your car starts to spin and you end up in a head-on collision and you're badly injured, that's going to overwhelm your coping resources. And so your nervous system doesn't know what to do with that. And in my thinking, the way I say it is it sort of softens the brain. And in the midst of that softened condition, we can start to believe really irrational things. Like, I'll never be safe again. There's something terrible will always happen, or whatever. And so it's really important to work with our rational thoughts. But it takes time to sort of reinstate that state of being rational after you've been through a trauma like that. So it kind of softens the brain, and then often people will become anxious or depressed as a result of trauma. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
I think you had a question in the chat.
Okay. Do you recommend early diagnosis if you detect symptoms of disorders? Can getting the diagnosis cause another disorder? Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt. The only drawback of getting a diagnosis is sometimes people over identify with them. They make too big of a deal. It kind of becomes almost an excuse, or even a pride thing. But for the most part, understanding what it is that you're going through can really help you know how to get past it, what kind of therapy you need, and be able to treat it better. What are some of the ways to treat someone experiencing hypoarousal? That means their arousal is too low. Is that what you're saying? I'm assuming that's what you're saying. So hypoarousal would be low arousal. Somebody's just, just not activated enough. I think there's some herbs that help with that. I think also exercise and getting your circulation going is a big thing. I know for me, I'm not a young person anymore, and I can start to feel really lethargic if I'm on my screens too much, or if I'm spending too much downtime, and I'll start to feel very unmotivated. And sometimes I'll just get up and like sweep the floor, or do jumping jacks, or put on music and run around my room or something to get my circulation going. Once I get my circulation going, I feel more capable of taking on challenges. So I'm assuming that's what you're talking about, like someone just feeling kind of flatlining a little bit. And if that's the case, then I would try getting your circulation going, and also try hydrating. A lot of times, sorry, my daughter just called me. A lot of times people are feeling lethargic because of dehydration.